So we have with us today Manuela Costa-Yeagley. She is the researcher that has done this study on women clergy. It is the most recent study. Prior to this, it was 20 years ago that somebody did study of women clergy, and she's going to tell you a little bit about her sample, but it's basically women Episcopal priests, Lutheran pastors, and United Methodist pastors. Manuela is with the University of Notre Dame. She is one of the researchers on the Wellness at Work team, which is part of the Mendoza Business School. She is an associate professor and is very keenly interested in women clergy and our wellness today and how we continue to thrive and be well. Out of her research, as well as some other programs, have been developed for overall clergy wellness and particular focus on women clergy wellness. And then we have with us Dr. Karoline Lewis. She is a professor at Luther Seminary. And Karoline, I'm going to let you say a little bit about what you want to share. Karoline has a book called, now I'm completely blanking on it, Karoline, you can tell us about your book. So.
Sure. Thanks, Carol. The book I think you're thinking about is She, 5 Keys to Unlock the Power of Women in Ministry, which was a book that originated out of a course that I have taught frequently in the past, haven't taught lately at Luther Seminary, but it was a book that when I went to teach that course at Luther, there was no textbook, there was no anything about, very few resources about women in ministry. And so that book really grew out of the course and the issues and topics that surfaced in those conversations in the classroom. And so now I use it as a textbook, but it very meaningful and important project for me, being a woman clergy, but also coming alongside my students and accompanying them in thinking about what does that mean, how to embody that fully in their ministry, what are some of the challenges, but also what are some of the joys that they will be walking into. So that's my main contribution here, I believe.
Great. Well, it's great to have you, and you're a wonderful conversationalist for those of you who remember last time. So I'm looking forward to this time.
Thanks, Carol.
And Bishop Ruth, I'm going to have you introduce yourself as well. You've got a very fascinating episcopate, for which I'm grateful for, but it's a little bit different from what those of us who would be going into a bishop's position would expect.
Thanks, Carol. Well, hello, everyone. It's great to be here. And thank you, Manuela, for the invitation to participate in your work. I am Ruth Woodliff-Stanley, and I serve as Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina. I think what Carol is referring to is the fact that we are a post-schism diocese. So in 2012, the diocese underwent a schism or split over issues, I would say, of justice and issues of theological difference. And we are still in the midst of that, of the legal outworkings of that schism. We are also very squarely focused on the future. And I come to this work just simply by way of having been a clergy person for the past 3+ decades. I was ordained to the diaconate in 1990 and to the priesthood in 1991. So I really resonated with a lot of your work, Manuela, and I very much look forward to our conversation today. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ruth. And Manuela, before you begin and sharing some of the information about your research, is there anything else that you'd like to add about your work at the University of Notre Dame or Mendoza Business School?
No, thank you, Karoline. You have been exhaustive. Okay, I'll just go ahead and share my screen. Right. I just wanted to quickly make a correction to the otherwise impeccable presentation by Carol. Unfortunately, we didn't have a Methodist in our sample because when we started the research, they were just undergoing a very difficult stage of their history with the General Conference that marked eventually the split. So our research actually includes the PCUSA, ELCA, and the Episcopal Church, but not, sadly, the Methodist Church. So I want to start, as usual, by presenting two stories, as we have done so far, that have two very different endings, if you want. One is a woman who has the ability to come back at a microaggression. The other one is a woman who doesn't have that ability. And we'll discuss approaches to how to react. We call them micro-interventions. And I want to focus particularly on the coming back, because one of the most widespread problems that we have found in our research is the inability oftentimes for women, or the lack of training in answering, in finding effective strategies in terms of coming back to a situation that is otherwise very paralyzing, embarrassing, and psychologically damaging. So we have here two stories, and these are two excerpts from two different interviews. One is with Norma. She's 60, associate rector, TEC. She has a training in anti-racist strategies, and you can see it from the way she reacts. And the other is Kay, much younger, 28, first employment as a curate. Both of them are Episcopal. First, Norma. When it comes to exercising authority, she says during the interview, my gender is largely a problem. Our church, the Episcopal Church, loves to talk about how forward-thinking and liberal it is. And yet, so often, I have had the parishioners ask something, and I would say, yeah, so you can do this, or no, you can't do that. And they would reply, well, let me go and ask S, as to say, the male rector. Really? And I had to ask one, so if S had said that, would you have questioned his authority in this way? And she, the parishioner was a woman as well, was taken aback that I said it out loud. And to her credit, she did go away and think about it and came back and said, you are probably right. I would have not gone at S about that decision in the way I came to you. This is Norma. The second is Kay, and she says in an interview, some time ago, I wore a knee-length dress and got a lot of comments about the length of my hemline from some of the older male members. By the end of the day, I felt so embarrassed because I felt like I had taken attention away from the service and teaching and didn't want to be a distraction. So each time somebody says something, either I apologize or I just kind of ignore it, let the comment pass. I try to wear black shoes all the time. And once I wore silver shoes because they matched what I was wearing, and I wanted to wear silver. And somebody came to me right before service and told me, how dare you wear silver shoes? My male colleague was wearing brown shoes. He didn't wear black shoes all the time, but nothing will be said about him. So sometimes I do avoid it. The most frequent and widespread form of prejudice that affects clergywomen is also the most difficult to challenge. It surfaces in commonplace interactions, and it wears a familiar face, a lay leader, a parishioner, a colleague. Scholarly literature defines these exchanges as microaggressions or everyday prejudice and describe them in this way: brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that is part of the difficulty. You don't know if they are malicious or not, that communicate derogatory or negative racial, gender, sexual orientation, or religious slights and insults to the target person or group. Over the 3 years of our study, most female clergy participants reported experiencing everyday prejudice or microaggressions. These interactions can be classified into different categories, but all have an implicitly derogatory connotation in common. The demeaning message generally targets clergywomen's gender, often intersecting other characteristics that are stigmatized, like race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age. We found that a lot, both young age and older age, and ability. Everyday gender-based prejudice has many faces. It can materialize in different forms. Benevolent sexism is one. Well-meaning paternalistic attitudes intended to protect the weaker sex. More frequently, that was probably by far one of the most frequent instances, it involved women's sexual objectification, remarks that were focused on women's bodies as objects of sexual pleasure. This is the dynamic we see at work in case situation, for instance, the young curate, where parishioners seem to police her dress and line or her silver shoes. Other categories of microaggressions aim at making women invisible. Interactions in which women's leadership role is bypassed or ignored, as in Norma's case, for instance, or emphasize their inferiority as professionals. They are not as competent, authoritative, or effective as men. Microaggressions also manifest as sexist language, patronizing or infantilizing names. There are many younger clergy, particularly clergywomen, spoke about being called a baby or sweetheart. Or conversely, derogatory adjectives such as aggressive, bitch, and so on. You list them. They can invoke gender stereotype, women as soft-spoken, submissive, caring, domestic, or overly emotional. Everyday discrimination is devastating because it is subtle and ambiguous. Overt expressions of prejudice are increasingly viewed as socially unacceptable and labeled as bigotry. So they are frowned upon. Scholarship shows that it is not overt prejudice that primarily harms women because they know how to recognize it. They are easy to identify and to counteract. Instead, these everyday paper cuts are particularly harmful because of the guesswork, self-doubting, and credibility challenges that they generate. Existing studies indicate that microaggressions invalidate women, dismiss their achievements, and limit their effectiveness with clear consequences for their psychological well-being and career advancement. In our study, a significant number of women described their reaction to a microaggression as feeling frozen. That was probably about a third, if not almost, if not more, of the women we interviewed. They would start asking themselves, did this happen? Really? How should I respond? And will they consider me oversensitive or weak if I do? The outcome of this inner dialogue was often self-silencing, guilt, shame, and a commitment to respond better, ruminating next time. Kay, the young curate of our second story, is a clear example of that reaction pattern. Now, microaggressions' main challenge is what scholars call attributional ambiguity. The real message behind these apparently ordinary exchanges is hidden as part of an otherwise friendly and polite interaction. This ambiguity leaves many women trapped in self-doubt, which is a prime factor of microaggressions' damaging impact, because it depletes the targets the person's psychological energy and nurtures low self-esteem, shame, and feelings of failure and powerlessness, which we found on a regular basis. So how can this destructive mechanism be disarmed? How can women come back effectively? Gerald Wing Sue is a lead researcher in this area and has gathered a great repertoire of effective response strategies. He has worked for a long time in the last few years, not only on diagnosing the evil, but also on finding response strategies that are based especially on the work of anti-racist organizations, but that can apply to any form of prejudice across the board: race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, age, just to mention a few. And you can find here a reference to his book, and you will receive the script of this presentation and this, of my research on this chapter when we'll be finished with this, as usual. Another resource that I recently found that I find very interesting is a research-based set of resources that has been elaborated by a firm called the Sunflower Learning. They work with the researcher I just mentioned. So this is a research-based, high-quality set of resources and tools that are for groups and individuals, and then can be used as DVDs or as Zoom sessions and also in streaming, and are targeted to make people aware of microaggressions and how they work, and also provide intervention strategies. Two resources in particular are relevant to what we are talking about. Unfortunately, they are targeted corporate, but they can be easily adjusted to any other setting. So one is how Ouch, the Stereotype Hurts, and explores the impact of bias and stereotypes and explain why people freeze, and also teach response strategies. The second is the most recent one, and it's focused on disarming microaggressions, and it is elaborated in coordination with the researcher I just mentioned. I don't have any stake in this, unfortunately, in this kind of resources, but you are very welcome to contact them. I was in contact with them just this week, and they would be very happy to help if you are interested in making contact with them, and they will give you access for a free trial, so you can explore a little bit. And the info contact is there with the email address you will receive also later. Okay, so a few examples of coming back strategies. Intervention strategies have different goals. So we are just going to scratch the surface of that and touching on how to unmask, or as we say, making the invisible visible, the ambiguous evident. But there are other strategies that may target, for instance, education or finding support. They also represent different intensities of engagement. The problem of, is this intentional or unintentional? Depending on the severity of the microaggression and on the context. In the limited space of this webinar, because we have to run, I'll go through just a few examples, but you can find the entire repertoire of strategies in the book I mentioned, and also in the training I just signaled before. The core objective here is making the invisible visible. This goal is crucial because microaggressions are not always explicit or deliberate. And much of the damage is done by the self-doubting and guesswork. Additionally, microaggressions often contain a mix of conscious and unconscious messages that may go beyond the perpetrator's awareness level. So naivete or lack of deliberate intent to insult make it difficult for offenders sometimes to change, because they perceive themselves, how many times you may have heard that, as free of bias or prejudice. I didn't know. I was not meaning this. Allies, it's important to say that allies and bystanders can also use these strategies to come back and help a target. So the first tactic is very obvious but very difficult. It is developing perspicacity. What is perspicacity? It is the ability to read between the lines and recognize the hidden meaning of a particular statement or action. action. This takes training and exercise. In our study, clergywomen often doubted their perception. Perspicacity is a form of discernment, and training in this area, what Karoline did, for instance, at Luther Seminary, is crucial and rare, especially in theological education. There is, and this doesn't apply only to gender microaggressions, but of other forms of microaggression. And yet, perspicacity is a very helpful tool for targets and bystanders or allies to identify and unmask biased attitudes. The second tactic is, we call it disempowering the innuendo by naming it. I'll make some examples. Naming an oppressive event means that it does not hold power on the target. So naming provides a language. Many women spoke about being silent, not being able to respond. Naming the nature of what you are living provides a language for people to describe their experience and claim their reality. It also forces perpetrators to problematize their role as potential oppressors. That is the case of Norma at the very beginning. If a parishioner ignores her advice and turns to the male rector, she replies, naming the problem. So do you think that women are not as authoritative as men? So is that correct? And so it forces the other to take a position and that explains or justifies the statement. Tactic 3, undermining the hidden message. This is a softer, less direct comeback strategy that is designed to increase perpetrators and onlookers' awareness. Let's say that a female clergy receives a backhanded compliment, which we have heard about in interviews a lot, such as, "You're quite a good priest for being a woman." Undermining the hidden message would involve bringing the possibly unconscious communication to the perpetrator's awareness and planting a seed of growth in him or her. A reply could be, "You're very kind. Luckily, excellence is equally distributed among men and women." So it undercuts the message, the offensive message. Tactic 4, challenge the stereotype. A Black female priest, example, assertively expresses an opinion during a meeting and is subsequently rebuked for her angry tone, quote unquote. The meta-communication here is Black women are bad-tempered, loud, and aggressive, which is a long-standing stereotype used against African-American women. The target or the ally recognizes the underlying stereotype and challenges it. Black women are often stereotyped as angry and aggressive. It's harmful and untrue. Here, it is completely unveiled. Tactic 5, universalize the negative trait. This is a strategy that does not directly challenge the stereotype as the previous one, but points out how the same trait could be applied to any group, not only to a marginalized one like women or people of color, and so on. For instance, it could turn a statement, it will turn a statement such as, "All women tend to fall prey to their emotions," into a universal trait. All human beings tend to fall prey to their emotions, one way or another. Men are no exception. We are seeing a demonstration live with the war in Ukraine. Tactic 6, ask for clarification of a statement or action. This again is an indirect way of coming back. Questioning or asking for the meaning of a person's words or behavior throws the ball back into the perpetrator's court. It buys you time. In case, for instance, this strategy would involve replying to those who question your silver shoes by saying, "Do you realize what you just said?" It is a simple question, but the aim of that question is to force the perpetrator to stop and reconsider, to communicate a disagreement, and to encourage exploration of a false belief or negative attitudes. In other terms, they need to justify what they just said. Tactic 7, and we are coming to the end. Make the innuendo explicit by rephrasing the statement or action. In this strategy, the target or ally adopts a questioning tone to rephrase a statement or an action and clarify the implicit message. So let's take a parishioner's comment about the case M line as an example. The reply would sound like, so let me understand. Are you telling me that female priests cannot wear knee-length dresses? This tactic is a little bit more direct than others. It is meant to make the person hear what they just said. It may trigger some defensive attitude, but it is intended to peel away perpetrators' naivete and show that their words or actions were not innocent. And last one, for now at least, reverse, redirect to mimic the statement or action of the offender as if it was meant for them. So turntable. This tactic aims, as I said, at turning tables and reversing the roles of perpetrator and target, often by using humor or sarcasm. That was a very powerful tool for many women. It seeks to challenge a false assumption without showing anger or hostility. For example, in case, it could have sounded as in the following way. So I take you only wear black shoes at work, correct? Does it mean that my male colleague who is wearing brown shoes is also doing something wrong? Reversal comebacks are brief, but potentially have a big impact because they throw perpetrators off balance. And they can be used also by allies and bystanders, obviously, to support friends and colleagues. Finally, these are just a few examples. You can find much more in the resources I just suggested. Training and practice here are very important, and they can unlock a rich repertoire of strategies and empower women, allies, educate parishioners, leaders, and foster cultural growth. What do you think about these comeback strategies? What tactics would you use? How can women move from powerlessness to empowerment and from self-doubt to confidence? What do you think? Okay, and I'll stop my share. Carol, back to you.
Thank you, Manuela. That's an extraordinarily rich source of not only tactics, but why we need those tactics. So I'm going to start with Karoline and Ruth, and this is what we've done in every webinar, is to ask you if your experience as a clergywoman resonates with Manuela's research, or whether there's something in there that doesn't resonate. In other words, we're going to check, we're just, out of your experience, we're checking the research. So Karoline, can we start with you?
Oh my, yes. Like every single thing. So and yes, what you've covered is such a really helpful, Manuela, list of the kinds of interactions that happen, and those practical ways of responding are really, really point to the kind of training or that kind of conversation that needs to happen. And you mentioned, Manuela, that the only reason that the Women in Ministry course was offered at Luther is because I insisted on it. It's certainly not in any way required in the curriculum. And it's not, and I'm working with the ELCIC, I think I mentioned this last, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, about sexism, because unless you start embedding that training, we just keep perpetuating the same patterns. The same things just keep happening over and over again. So yeah, 100% all the things.
Okay.
And to have experienced all the things, all the time.
All the time.
Like one of the things that I have my students do in that course is to keep a sexism log for a week. Because sometimes it's so unbelievable. Like you can't even believe that somebody just said that to you in the 21st century. You're like, aren't we past this? And so we rationalize that. Did that person really say that? Like, really? That really happened? But not just for you, but where you see it throughout the culture, because that's part of, it's one thing to name it here and, between two people, but then the other thing to name the wider ways in which our culture is socialized in certain ways that's acceptable. And so when you start keeping that sexism log for yourself, but then also sexism in the everyday world, in your community, nationally, globally, it's all the time. And then after a week you go, oh yeah, it's real. All the things are real.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Ruth, how about you? Does your experience reflect Manuela's research, or is there something in there that you think isn't quite sounding right to you?
Ditto everything Karoline just said. And I would say all the things that have been said to me and also done. So I was sitting here having memories of, just intrusions, physical intrusions in my being that have happened for me in public settings over and over through the years. My hair, people coming up and doing this without asking, people making comments, people approaching my body in a certain way. So all of that absolutely there. I realized as I was listening to you that as I've continued in my own journey to work on dismantling my own racism and dealing with systemic and structural racism, I am learning really about the experience of microaggressions in that context. It has brought in front of me in a new way my own experience and my own experience as a woman, both as a woman sitting with a tremendous amount of privilege and yet sitting with this daily Karoline log that I still could and keep adding to. And also I would say one thing that really made me curious was hearing Norma's story and her incredible presence and capacity to deal with that parishioner in that way. I hope we might come back to that, because I found myself challenged by that and thinking, there's a heat that comes in me that makes it difficult to do that at times. And I'm not normally a sarcastic person, but a go-to for me is the one that was dealt with sarcasm, but with an edge, because I know that I'm coming from that place of heat. And the last thing I'll say about that is I also thought about the difference between dealing with people with whom I'm in relationship, which I think she was. Both of those case studies you presented were women in relationship with these folks. And that's a distinct thing from dealing with people in the public. And I'm talking about in the public within the realm of the church presently. And I've experienced that in bishop races, by the way, where, I don't know the folks in front of me. And they take these kind of liberties with microaggressions of every imaginable sort. And there's not a relationship there to deal with. So anyway, that came to me. But yes, I resonated very strongly.
Okay. I want to say great. And yet it's kind of sad to say, oh, yes, you both have had a lot of experiences of sexism directed at you. I'm very aware that when this happens, it's in public settings. And Manuela's research talked about that these microaggressions can generate shame, self-doubt, a sense of she said, I think one point she said, you freeze, you're trapped. So is there a way, do you have a strategy, before we will move on to the other tactics, do you have a strategy in the moment that when you are hit with the heat, Ruth, that you just accept it for what it is, you realize you're going to go back to it? Like, we've all experienced oh no, what do I say now? So anything?
Yeah, I was thinking about that with regard to the second reality of disempowering the innuendo by naming it, which I think is a really powerful strategy or tactic. And I would add to that, I mean, one of the things that I've kind of trained myself to do is that naming, that sometimes because of the moment, or like you were saying, Bishop Ruth, like because of, is there a relationship going forward or not, you know, which gives you certain freedoms to say what you want to say or not. But I find that if I can't say if I'm in that moment, for me to name it in my head is so helpful. Like if I can identify, and that's why one of the other things that I really strongly recommend and have my students practice and people I'm working with is to have their glossary in their minds so that they can say like, oh, mansplaining. And you know, and so because I present, for example, all the time, virtually every single time I'm doing a public presentation, I will have a mansplainer every single time. And now I could exhaust myself and say, you know, and engage that, or I could just say, oh, mansplainer, check, and move on with my life. And so that is probably one of the biggest helps for me is that conscious naming, maybe not out loud, but I actually do name it in my head and I identify exactly what's just happened. And that identification then takes a little bit of the heat away and allows me to move on to what I need to do and not be completely dissolved in the moment because of that comment, which used to happen to me. I would just fall apart and not be able to do what I want to do. And so that's one thing I would add as a tactic that I've practiced over the years.
Great. Thank you, Karoline. Ruth, briefly, anything? Because I have a bunch of other questions about practice and training that I want to get to before we get to our participants' questions, and also need to hear from Manuela about this. But Ruth, just quick, something that you do that.
Well, I think you're talking. Sure, Karoline, I think you're talking about perspicacity. I don't know how to say that word well because I don't use it often, but that you talked about, Manuela, and I think for me, I do something similar, and I have a couple of, you know, beloved women friends that are in my head with me when something like that happens. And so I have a little bit of a humor riff going with them as if they're there, like, can you believe it? And then usually later I'll, you know, might be texting them about it, but I find it having an inner humor dialogue going helps me.
Helps. Great. Thank you. Okay. So Manuela, you laid out these wonderful 8 tactics as well as resources to become more familiar with them and practice them. I'm wondering, practice is the best when we can do it with one another. Something like you were saying, Ruth, of you have women friends that this is a topic of conversation before you get into these situations. You know, when we practice something, we have someone who is telling us and giving us real-time feedback so that it becomes a natural part of what we say or what we speak. So what are some of the ways in which either any of you, the 3 of you, see that this practice can take place and the training can take place? Karoline, your course is an example, but other ways.
I think, well, the idea would be really that theological education included this kind of training, because it's important to recognize that this is one of the things that I like about the trainings that I provided as a resource, is that they consider prejudice as a problem across the board. That does not just, these are tools that apply to people who are people of color, people with who are differently able, or people who are any kind of prejudice is actually the object. In fact, the book is originally, I adapted it, but it's originally tailored for racial microaggressions, and I adapted the examples to gender, but it's very easy once you know that reality. So that is certainly something that that should be done. But I think that one of the very healthy things that women do, most of our interviewees at least, was that they had either a circle of female friends who share the same kind of job. One of the negative things that could happen was the ruminating without a positive outlet. So rehearsing, going over and over, and so on. If you don't reply on the moment, on the spot, you can talk about that, the incident, with your therapist, your spiritual director, whoever you want to talk to, or a clergywoman friend. But you can also come back later and use one of those strategies to have an explanation, to ask for a clarification from the person. Norma, the woman I mentioned at the beginning, and I'm glad that Ruth was raising her example and asking more information. She had a full training in anti-racist strategies. She was an anti-racist advocate before even being a priest. So she had a facility and a way of recognizing things at the very beginning that comes with time. And one of the things we have seen, and I'll shut up with that, is that it changes with time. People become better at this with experience.
Okay. Better at it with experience. All right. Ruth, on a diocesan level, do you have any ideas of what can be done, not just by the women in any particular diocese, but by colleagues and members of congregations?
Well, I think that the training that you're providing and pointing us to, Manuela, is very, very important for us to be doing really across the board in dealing with a whole range of ways in which human beings oppress one another, one of them certainly being sexism. And so we are in the midst of addressing, updating that work and addressing it. I think we have to have specific leadership bodies with their eyes trained on these issues, and not just assume that we will keep doing this work, because we will not unless we are specifically focused on it. I also think there are, by raising systemic and structural issues around parity, around employment opportunities, around things like maternity leave, I mean, a whole host of things. We then also create a more hospitable context in which to address things like microaggressions, in which to address the kind of violence on different levels that women experience regularly.
Okay. I love that phrase, create a hospitable context in which to address microaggressions. That's great. Thank you. So I'm going to ask now, Catherine, thank you for following the chat, and Mary Beth, the Q&A. Are there things from our participants that we can ask? We have about 10 minutes left, and I'm relying on you to cue me on what.
Yes, got it. There are three really great questions in the chat, and so I'm going to go in the order that they have been received. The first one is directed towards Bishop Ruth. She says, as one who has a distinctive haircut herself, a buzz cut that is quite short for a female, I'd love to ask Bishop Ruth if anyone has asked her about her crazy hair, smile, and how might she respond?
Yeah, I may start weeping right now about this one. Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I told you, I've had more than one experience actually of someone coming up to me and just doing this. and saying, "Oh my God, your hair." I had an experience of someone saying to me, "May I have a word with you?" about 2 minutes before I was going on stage to speak as a candidate for bishop in another location than where I am now. And I said, "Sure." And I thought, I was prepared to engage any theological question. And the person said, smirked. The man smirked and said, "Has anyone ever told you that you look like Professor Trelawney out of Hogwarts?" So I've had people suggest to me that I should tame my hair. I've had comments about my hair in miter. So yes. I did just recently, I did a generalizing move around that. So I was so thrilled to see that tactic and realize, oh, I just did that. Where, and an ally did it with me, where someone was making a crack about my hair and miter. Miter, if being the headpiece that we wear as bishops. And this man who has curly hair said, God, it is such a thing when we have curly hair. It's a different thing than for folks with straight hair. So he immediately stepped in as an ally, which I was grateful for. But yes, I have had that. Almost, I would say my hair is the biggest thing for some reason for folks.
Mhm. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I think this one is a sort of a question for Manuela, but Karoline, maybe as well. I'm wondering what the research says around microaggressions and negative professional impacts against women at different ages. As I age, I notice it changing and wonder how it will professionally continue to impact me/us.
Karoline, do you want to say something? Okay. In the research, it affected women differently, and it's absolutely correct. Ageism is alive and well as an intersectional form of prejudice. Younger women tended to be infantilized very much in the research. They were often the object of little nicknaming like baby, sweetie, sweetheart, often treated as children, and or objectified from a sexual viewpoint for their body being a distraction. You have seen that in the case of Kay. Older women were generally less exposed, but at the same time also their age often came under the spot, especially in the relationship with, the Episcopal Church, but all churches in general, have a high number of people who have an incongruous kind of situation because they are older, but often they are just starting their career as priests. They may be 50s, and so they are at the same time mature, but younger and considered as recruits. So much of the microaggressions that we saw in a more mature women had to do with this incongruity. So being considered as unexperienced and like pawns in a way, while being at the same time someone who was older. That was a little bit the thing that changed. We saw that marital status, for instance, changed a lot of things, not just age. That if you are married and of a certain age, you have a certain capital that is not available to women, for instance, who are single or younger. I would say that, probably in terms of frequency, younger women or women like, let's say, below 50 tended to be more targeted than women above that age, with the exception of women in that position I just specified, being more mature, but at just the beginning of their career, if that makes sense.
Great. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you. The last question here is, anyone can answer this one. I would love to hear strategies for working with bosses who undervalue our contributions based on sexist bias. We have one more after this.
I'll take a stab at that. I think it always depends on the context in terms of the ways in which persons who are supervising have that bias. And so how is it that they're not at all an ally and you recognize that? and depending on what you're asking for. But I think one of the main things is to know exactly what you value, but why you value yourself, to know what you are bringing to the table, what's at stake for you, that you live with an integrity between your core values and who you know yourself to be. And then you live that out in your decisions and how you do ministry. And so I think the more we can live with that kind of integrity in our ministry, that helps in that kind of situation. Or if you are constantly put in situations where it's clear that sexist bias is going on, that you go back to what you're called there to do. Like I'm not called to make the coffee for the council meetings. I'm called to, but that takes a lot of work, and in terms of really relying on your core commitments and your core values, and also what's at stake for you theologically. I think being able to articulate that that I'm not just doing a job, but there's something important for me that I'm embodying theologically here, and I'm going to live that out regardless of what the response is. That's one thought I have.
I just wanted to add very quickly for Ruth. One of the things we saw in the research, Ruth, is that while there are a number of rectors, male rectors who are very supportive of women, one of the problems we found on a regular basis was sometimes the power differential between a younger first employment curate female, and the power imbalance is very high, and because of rectors have a great amount of autonomy and that control on what they do. There is no accountability structure. Let's put it this way: that the perception was that there was no recourse clear, because choosing between a long course rector and a curate is not a difficult choice when it comes to conflicts sometimes.
Yeah. Last question in the Q&A, and this is already starting to be picked up in the chat, which is great. And this brings us a little bit full circle from where we actually started with our first webinar back in October. And the question is actually about, and personal for me, because I will be exploring a first call next year. Are these issues reviewed in the context of transition ministries? I have often wondered if transition ministers have conversations with parish search committees and vestries about bias against women, and how to identify implicit bias in the search process.
Mm.
You want to go ahead?
Go ahead. Do you want to speak for the Lutheran Church, Karoline, and then we'll have Ruth talk about the Episcopal Church?
I know of no structural reality within a synod that tends that. And that's one of the problems. It's a huge problem, is that there's nothing structurally put in place that says in those transitions a reevaluation or a consciousness training of what expectations the congregation has for the next pastor, and that kind of bias training. I know of no synod that does that.
So Ruth?
There's something going on that is pertinent to this in the thread with Woodliff-Stanley around her work in South Dakota that I think is worth lifting up here, because I think it's happening mainly in a case-by-case basis. So I would agree with Karoline that we don't have anything system-wide, with the one modest exception that there is some work being done in Episcopal races, not uniformly adopted, but around just very basic video material and training material being offered at a church-wide level for dioceses to use, but not, it's not a requirement, but it is at least beginning to put some things in front of search committees in the early phases.
Great. Okay. So Mary Beth, does that wrap it up for the questions we can get to now?
Yes, that does.
All right. Well, I want to thank Karoline. I want to thank Ruth. I particularly want to thank Manuela for her wonderful research. These are research-based tools, and there's a lot that we can act on in a positive way from today. And I appreciate the perspective of people who have been experiencing this kind of sexism throughout their ministries. So it's there, and we're learning different ways to address it and take care of ourselves around it. So thank you very much, everyone. The next webinar is on, Mary Beth, do you have the slide up? Because where I am, I can't see. Okay, there we are. Our next webinar is the first Wednesday of the month. It will be our final one. We have a series of 6. So if you have a friend that hasn't seen any of them, they're still welcome to come. And all of these are recorded and will be put on a platform where they're accessible after this series. So thank you, everyone, for being with us today. There it is, April 6th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Developing your well-being toolkit. So I hope you mark that date down, April 6th, 3 p.m. Eastern. And blessings to all of you as we enter this holy season of Lent.